Live streaming, and we're starting. I think Andy can begin.
Well, hello everyone, and welcome to all and to people from all over the country. My name is Andy Foyce. I am the chair of the Administrative Conference of the United States, what we often call ACUS. Today is the first installment of a multi-part forum on assisting parties in federal agency adjudication that ACUS is pleased to host along with the Legal Services Corporation. Today's important topic is increasing representation in federal administrative proceedings. For those of you who are not familiar with ACUS, we are a federal executive branch agency that brings together government officials and private sector experts to identify ways to improve federal administrative procedures. And since 1968, ACUS has issued hundreds of recommendations, many of them on this topic, intended to improve the kinds of federal programs that will be discussed through this forum. At the next installment, in a couple of months, I will speak more about how ACUS is working to ensure that everyone seeking benefits and services under federal programs, including members of historically underserved communities, can access the assistance they need. Now let me turn things over to Ron Flagg, president of LSC. Ron has served as president of LSC since 2020, and before that served for many years as LSC's vice president for legal affairs and its general counsel. He has been a long time and outspoken advocate for expanding access to legal services. And finally, I'd like to close with thanks to staff on both sides, ACUS and LSC, for the excellent work they've done preparing for this forum. Ron, over to you.
Andy, thanks so much for your kind introduction. LSC is profoundly grateful that ACUS is exploring strategies to expand access to representation in federal administrative proceedings. And we're excited to collaborate with you on this important educational series. And let me thank all of you who have tuned in today for joining us and for the role we hope you will play going forward. For our audience members who are not familiar with the Legal Services Corporation, we are the single largest funder of civil legal aid for low-income Americans in the country. LSC funds 132 independent nonprofit legal aid organizations that serve all 50 states, the territories, and the District of Columbia, and operate out of 900 offices. Our grantees assist people with a wide range of civil legal issues, including child support and custody, employment, housing, consumer debt, and income maintenance, just to mention a few of those issue areas. Every day, attorneys at LSC grantees assist individuals with applications for or appeals involving federal benefits like supplemental security income, veterans benefits, and workers' compensation, again, just to mention a few. Access to these benefits can be life-changing, whether it's for veterans, people with disabilities, people experiencing homeless, or others. Unfortunately, too many people go unrepresented in these and other civil legal proceedings and are adversely affected by that lack of representation. Earlier this year, LSC published the results of our 2022 Justice Gap study. Now, what is that justice gap? It is the difference between the civil legal needs of low-income Americans and the resources available to meet those needs. The study measured the number of substantial civil legal problems that individuals face and for which they are unable to obtain any or enough legal help to resolve. The results of our Justice Gap study were truly staggering. In 2017, the last year we did a Justice Gap study, low-income individuals did not receive any or enough legal help to resolve 86% of the legal problems they faced. you would have thought 86% was close to the top. Fast forward 5 years into the pandemic, and that already very high, astronomically high number has increased. In 2022, individuals did not receive any or enough legal help to resolve 92% of their substantial legal problems. The justice gap is over 90%. Access to federal benefits is one of the many legal issues for which low-income individuals were unable to obtain adequate legal assistance. And although research has shown that representation, whether it's by lawyers or non-lawyers with training and representing people in administrative proceedings, either sorts of representation profoundly increases both the efficiency of the administrative process and the likelihood that an applicant for benefits will prevail on their claim. There are neither enough resources nor enough attorneys to represent every applicant who needs representation. This reality is distressing enough for those of us who work to narrow the justice gap. But of course, it is even more distressing for the people in need of that assistance and for whom the assistance could really be a break the company case. Our speakers today will explore the justice gap as it is experienced in the federal administrative adjudicative process. Their views are informed by their experiences as federal adjudicators and as advocates for individuals navigating the administrative process. I am certain that by the end of our time together today, we will have a greater understanding of both the challenges facing us and the opportunities available as we work to improve access to justice in the administrative process. It is now my pleasure to introduce one of our key collaborators, today's moderator, Jeremy Graybois. Jeremy is the acting research director for the Administrative Conference of the United States and has written extensively on the topic of federal agency adjudication. His full bio is available in the chat, along with those of the panelists. Jeremy, again, thank you for all you're doing, and over to you.
Thanks so much, Ron, and hello to everyone joining us today. Millions of people each year navigate processes of administrative adjudication to access critical benefits administered by federal agencies or provided under federal programs. We've perhaps all known someone who has had to navigate some administrative process to access Social Security benefits, veterans benefits, unemployment insurance, workers' compensation, visas, healthcare coverage, food stamps, or affordable housing. You may have worked with individuals who, to earn a living, need to successfully navigate these processes to obtain licenses or permits, secure grants or loans, or obtain IP protections. You may have worked with people who find themselves in administrative processes defending themselves against accusations that they have broken the law. Whether they involve access to benefits and services or regulatory enforcement actions, administrative proceedings can be critical to individuals' well-being and central to their flourishing. And so it's vital that the individuals who seek to navigate these complex systems have the assistance they need. But as Ron explained, many people simply do not have adequate assistance in administrative proceedings. Through several panels, this forum will examine what all of us in the public and private sectors alike can do to remedy this situation. Future panels will highlight innovative ways that agencies and private sector organizations can work together to promote effective representation and to expand services for self-represented parties. In today's panel, though, we'll start by examining why many parties in administrative processes, especially members of historically underserved communities, often do not have professional representation and ways to help them access the representation they need. To help us understand the topic, we are joined by 4 experts. Nancy Griswold is the Deputy Director of the Office of Workers' Compensation at the U.S. Department of Labor. Nancy previously served as the Chief Administrative Law Judge at the Office of Medicare Hearings and Appeals and as a Social Security Administration judge. Dee Dee Peterson is the Executive Director of Legal Action of Wisconsin. She has worked for equal justice for more than 30 years, including at the Wisconsin Equal Justice Fund and at the National Housing Law Project. Richard Preble is Supervising Attorney of the Veterans Advocacy Project at Legal Aid of Southeastern Pennsylvania. a project he helped establish 2 years ago. Richard was previously an Equal Justice Works Fellow, providing representation and outreach to veterans, military personnel, and their families, and he teaches representing veterans in administrative practice at Villanova Law. And Ashley Tabador is Chief Counsel of the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. Before joining USCIS, she served as an immigration judge and was president of the National Association of Immigration Judges. Ashley has also served as an assistant U.S. attorney and trial attorney with the Justice Department's Civil Division. Today's discussion will proceed in 2 parts. We'll first address barriers that individuals face in accessing representation in administrative adjudications, and then we'll talk about possible solutions. We'll save some room at the end for any questions you may have. But I'd like to start first with a question that I'll pose to all of the panelists. In the administrative programs with which you're familiar, what impact does representation or self-representation have on values like procedural fairness, substantive accuracy, administrative efficiency, and equity? Nancy, let me turn to you first.
All right, thanks so much. First of all, it's great to be here on this panel. I do think it's an important topic. I will say from the federal perspective, and I've been with 3 of the big programs, Social Security, Medicare, and now with workers' compensation. Many, if not most, federal programs are designed so that people can represent themselves. And that works really well in most cases, but it doesn't work all the time. And when claims become contested or they get very, very complicated, then it becomes a bit of a morass for people to navigate on their own. I think that in all of our programs, our goals, and I was an administrative law judge, and now I'm a manager administrator in workers' comp, but the goal is to reach the correct outcome, whether that be to pay benefits where they're due or to preserve benefits by not paying so that those benefits are available to people who are properly entitled. So correct outcome is critical. Part of that is having access to a complete record, because we can only make a decision that's as good as the information we have in front of us. If we're missing some critical piece of information, then our decision is going to be flawed at the outset. So I think keeping those goals in mind helps us understand how representation can be critically important, both in kind of gathering that information and then presenting it in a way that is accessible and persuasive. So I think that would be my kind of concise answer to why it affects due process, can affect due process, and mostly in cases that are going to be contested or that are going to be very, very complex. I think I would add that part of the problem is in federal programs, many people start out representing themselves and then only go forward to get representation, either when they get a negative result or when the process becomes so difficult that they need assistance. So I think that delay in accessing representation in appropriate cases can also be a real problem. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Dee Dee.
I would just add something very short to what Nancy said. When we are providing representation, that is exactly what we're doing, is presenting information on behalf of the client who may or may not be in a good position to present it themselves. And we have faith in the system that when we present information, that the system works for people. And that is key to our representation, is seeing ourselves as information presenters and trusting that the system takes that information and makes good decisions based on that information. The more information we can feed to the systems, the better off the client is.
Thank you. Richard.
Echoing everything that Nancy and Dee Dee have said so far, kind of talking about how we are able to work with the individuals that we serve to tell their story. I've had a lot of clients who will say, oh, that's not relevant. And then we talk about it a little more. And I'm like, well, actually, that's very relevant. And this is what I primarily work with the VA, the DOD, and Social Security. And so it's like, well, that's actually something the VA specifically wants to know more about. So that's kind of where we're able to advocate for individuals. And in regards to the delay of access, one of the things that we really see is the impact of working with individuals at the front end of applications. So helping them file their VA benefits application, their Social Security at the initial instance, so that they're not waiting until they have to file an appeal. We know that the appellate system within federal administrative agency adjudication takes a long time. So if we have the ability to help in that initial instance, we see that we have a higher likelihood of getting benefits quicker to individuals. Even when we do have to go through the appellate process, having someone to represent an individual sees a profound increase in positive outcomes. This year alone, our veterans program here at Legal Aid has increased income for the veterans that we've gotten benefits for from both the VA and Social Security by almost $10 million. This year alone, we've gotten over $520,000 in retroactive benefits for our clients. It's money directly into our clients' pockets, working with individuals who are at risk of homelessness, individuals who are lower income, to be able to get that money right away, and using the knowledge and expertise that we have as lawyers to make sure that the system works correctly and works effectively and quickly for the individuals that we're working with.
Thank you, Richard. And Ashley.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for including me on this panel. And actually, I really appreciate going last because I could start off with a lot of ditto. I absolutely agree with everything that was said. What I was hoping to do with perhaps my piece is to take a little liberty and introduce our agency, because I do think it adds a little bit of nuance. It is a little bit different than your traditional benefits granting agencies when you talk about it in the context of workers' compensation, Social Security, even Veterans Administration. So with that, I wanted to add a little bit of the nuance for us that we have to deal with, in addition to all the other great points that were raised. So with USCIS, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, our agency is in charge of administering the nation's lawful immigration status. And I emphasize lawful because it's different than when dealing with enforcement action by the Department of Homeland Security. And so it deals with anybody who wants to navigate the immigration system through the legal means. And I recognize immediately that when it comes to immigration law, we're talking about one of the most complex areas of the law, sometimes perhaps the most complex, perhaps competing with our tax code. To put things more in context for us, our agency receives on average maybe 9 million requests a year. Last year, I believe we processed about 8 million requests, but we still have over 5 million case backlog. So again, I think those numbers help to contextualize things a little bit. Here's another part that's different with our agency. We are largely a fee-funded agency, and that makes a big difference in how we have to manage our workload. Over 90% of our work is fee-funded, but we also have a unfunded mandate. We have a humanitarian mission relating to our asylum, refugee, some of our vulnerable population visa programs. So those are, again, things that add some additional nuance. We have dozens of different types of requests that the immigration legal system provides, from pretty simple to a highly complex. And so we also have our audience who can be quite unsophisticated, even illiterate, to very sophisticated and quite savvy. So that's the other part that I think for us is another part to consider. But for the most part, most of the people who we deal with have English as their second language. So sometimes they can be quite conversant or proficient, but that is an extra hurdle for us. Similar to what I think Nancy mentioned, I couldn't agree more that the North Star is to try to create programs that allow for us, for people to self-navigate and for us to be able to reach the right decision. So I think to that end, we try to provide a lot of information. If you take a look at our website, and I really encourage you to do that, you can see we have an extensive set of information, policy manuals that are designed to walk you through step by step, our instructions for all of the forms. We have web alerts, announcements, everything like that. But I can also appreciate that that could be overwhelming too for someone who's trying to navigate the system. So we do recognize that regulations and statute does recognize a right to counsel. So to me, that is important focus on recognizing that access to counsel can be a very key component of helping us reach the North Star that we've all agreed to. So to go back to the ditto, the impact as to due process, it's the issue of notice and an opportunity to be heard. So how do we make sure people fully understand and have a chance to be heard? What is substantive accuracy? Nancy mentioned developing the record. What is efficiencies? Reducing the amount of time that we have to engage and repeat and ask for additional evidence. And equity, sort of making sure that we're making the right decisions. So timing of assistance is also very important, particularly in our area, where if you present conflicting information, it can have severe consequence. So I did want to sort of kind of connect all of those dots together in my ditto to say, these are all the challenges and nuances and that we face as well.
Thank you so much, Ashley, and thank you, all of you. I hope today's conversation will be really a discussion among the panelists. So let me first offer you all an opportunity to add any thoughts or respond to each other.
Yeah, I'll just build on what Ashley said, because we also have extensive databases on or websites on each of our programs that provide information and guides and answers to frequently asked questions. We also have areas that are designated for authorized representatives to go so that they can also get some information. And our representatives can be in either attorneys or non-attorney representatives. So we try to help as much as we can all types of representatives that are seeking to provide assistance.
And I'll just say, I think it was something that Nancy had brought up earlier, was that the system has the ability to work well when it works. And I agree with that. I totally agree with that. There's a lot of individuals that I work with who talk about how amazing the VA is. And the VA is amazing. The VA is the largest healthcare system in our country. It has one of the largest compensation programs in the United States. But it works well when it works well. For individuals who have difficulty in accessing that and ensuring that the VA is following their rules, making sure Social Security is following their rules as laid out in the Code of Federal Regulations is sometimes difficult. And that's really where an attorney advocate or a non-attorney advocate who's versed in those regulations has the ability to get in there and say, hey, VA, hey, Social Security, this is actually what the law says, and this is the procedure that you're supposed to follow. Now follow this procedure for the individual that we're working with. And as we ensure that access, as we ensure that the process is followed, we get to what Ashley had mentioned, that equity and fairness for individuals who have applied for these programs. And I think one of the other attorneys that I work with, we had a veteran who had applied for benefits with the VA, and then their application just sat there. It was like 3,000 days from the date that they filed their application until the actual decision was issued. And it's not because like they were sending in and creating the record, it was literally just sitting there. The VA had forgotten about it. It had gotten lost in the system, but having access to an advocate who has access to the VA system to be able to say, hey, something's going on here because this person hasn't heard from you. And it's been 3,000 days, which is quite a bit of time to get access to that system. So I just wanted to add that.
And I may jump on what you just said, Richard. It prompted me to think about another interesting experience. You mentioned I was an immigration judge before at Department of Justice, and that was certainly a fabulous experience in learning at it from a sort of a judicial perspective. And now I'm in a much more operationally, it is a completely different system. And so what I have found here, both the just sheer size, the number of people administering and operating a system of this magnitude, that's why I started with that. And I have found that one of the challenges is that if the situation, if the case presents something slightly different, because the system is sort of designed to go through a certain basic course, a certain life of a case, so to speak. And if you add a couple of twists and turns, the likelihood of it sort of going off course just exponentially increases. And it's not because of anybody's ill motivation or anything like that. It's just trying to operationalize something of this magnitude. And that's why having, in those instances, someone who can connect the dots, who can appreciate how these things interact with each other becomes very effective. And why it's also very important, frankly, from our perspective, in having as much transparency, accountability, engagement with the public, so that you too, from the outside, as you're navigating, can appreciate how the system works and can help us, frankly, sometimes to say, hey, my case has been sitting for, as you said, 3,000 days. Like, this just doesn't make sense, right? And we really try. We have processing times information. We provide checklists, like Nancy said, help people sort of try to minimize the ways that things can go off. But I thought that was a very good point that you noted too.
I think what Richard said is key, which is the timing of representation is very important, especially in the world of legal services, which is a world of scant resources. So the timing of when we step in is really important. And it's especially important when you think about self-representation, because just like these systems work well while they're working until they don't, self-representation works well until it doesn't. And so that's where the timing becomes really important and of course you do want to empower people to be able to advocate for themselves and to understand systems themselves. But when that fails, or when it, as Ashley's saying, when there's some barrier that just doesn't fit in with the way that the process is supposed to work, the timing of us stepping in is really key. We at Legal Action talk about administrative law processes as a maze. We talk about it as a Byzantine, picture a corn maze. And every time you turn, it's a new rule that you've got to be aware of. And if you make that turn and you get stuck at that wall, you're stuck. And I think that acknowledging just how Byzantine all of these individual systems are in their own right is really important when you're thinking about when to put the representation into the puzzle.
So let's talk about barriers that people face in accessing representation. There's lots of factors that might erect barriers for people in accessing representation: costs, geographic isolation, limited English proficiency, a lack of information, a lack of capacities by representatives. In the programs with which you're familiar, what do you see as the most significant barrier or barriers that people face in accessing representation? I know you had some fantastic thoughts in our pre-meeting session, Dee Dee. Can I turn to you first?
Sure. Our experience has been and has shown that the largest barrier to accessing any systems, and including administrative systems, is that our clients, who are all very poor and often have been poor for a long time, our clients are exhausted. They are beat up by the world, by these systems, including the systems which we're telling them they need to access in order to get their benefits. And they're just frankly very tired, and that's legitimate. And it's very important to acknowledge that as a barrier to accessing representation. And I don't mean that it's only that we legal services are the last resort for people, because we often are. I mean something more than that, which is that often folks don't call us because of that sense of always running into the same no, always running into the same, and always being feeling like they're beat up in the system. They don't want to call to get help because they're exhausted. And I think it's incredibly important to acknowledge that, both to our clients, but to ourselves. And when we're thinking about why folks aren't calling us, and very actively working to set aside space and time to understand that, and understand how that is an access issue.
Thank you. Others, what do you think is the most significant barriers that people face in accessing representation? Nancy.
Yeah, so I'll speak for our programs, because I actually went out and asked the question to our 4 programs, and the uniform answer related to cost. And we have one program, the energy program, that limits attorneys' fees. It's a legal limitation on what attorneys can charge. And if it's essentially an uncontested, file an application and you get benefits, then fees are limited to 2% of recovery. And the maximum would be 10% if they assist someone with objections to a recommended decision and then obtain payment. And in the legal world, that is a small fee. So it's hard to incentivize people to take those cases. The other would be, the other example I would give would be in the FICA program, because contingency fees are not permitted there. So mostly representatives will charge and get paid for their work on an hourly fee basis. So that very much makes representation sort of an equity issue, because it becomes available to those who can afford it. But for those who can't, then it becomes a significant problem. So I think our primary barrier would be either cost or perceived cost, and then the unwillingness or the lack of incentive in some federal programs for attorneys or other authorized trained representatives to engage in the sort of work that we do.
I would say, kind of going off of both what Dee Dee and Nancy were saying in regards to, first of all, with what Dee Dee was saying in regards to the being tired of the system, us being a part of that system. There's so many individuals who come to us, one, thinking that I am the VA, which is just so not true. And I'm like, trust me, I dislike their system just as much as you do. But then you get to someone who's so used to being in these social service agencies where everything is name, date of birth, social security number, income, address. It's like you go through the intakes every single place you go. And we are just another person with that kind of barrier to access those services. You have to talk to someone to talk to someone to talk to someone to finally talk to a lawyer. And I think that in and of itself is a barrier, because people are going to come to us exhausted. And then on top of that, you have individuals who, on top of the exhaustion of the system, have been dealing with, a lot of the individuals that we work with have experienced significant trauma from their military service. So on top of that barrier of having to go through these systems, it's having to tell yet another person about what happened and not knowing whether or not they're going to be able to help you, and not knowing whether or not should I tell them everything, because they probably aren't going to be able to help. And so that becomes extremely difficult. And to Nancy's point, talking about limited resources and funding itself, we are an organization that is funded through the Legal Services Corporation. We have a lot of funding such as LSC, and because of that funding and because of the community in which we serve, we are limited in who we are able to take on as clients, and that usually comes with an income limit. For example, most of our clients have to be between 125 and 200% of the federal poverty level. That limits a lot of individuals who may need services, but because they're already receiving something from the VA or something from Social Security, they're just outside of that income limit. And even though we want to help them, and we think that we would be in the best position to help them, because of that resource limitation, it's not something that we are able to do at this time. And so we have to either have them go talk to a non-attorney advocate, whether that be the local county veteran service officer, or send them to a law firm who, like Nancy is saying, sometimes that's going to be, depending on how they charge their fees, is going to be something that an individual who we probably could serve is not going to be able to pay for. But then another thing that I think is important is just knowing that we exist. There are so many individuals who don't even realize, one, that legal aid services exist, but two, what we have the ability to do. During the pandemic, one of the big things that we did within legal aid was helping people with unemployment compensation. And I know that's not a federal program, but one of the things that we saw was we were able to provide legal advice about that program, but also reaching out to the unemployment program and being like, hey, someone hasn't heard from you. Is there any way we can expedite this? They have no income. This is the stuff that's going on. And in and of itself may not seem like something a lawyer would do, but we get that information, we provide that advice, and then we help with that extra step. And so really understanding the full scope of what a legal services attorney has the ability to do, and knowing that we exist, and at least reaching out and saying, hey, is this something that y'all can help with? Because at the end of the day, even if it's not something we can do, we probably have at least a warm referral that we may be able to get you connected into the right space.
So I think you all raise a number of interesting questions. I think there's lots of people within agencies who might want to do something in this space, but they might not know, for example, that exhaustion is a barrier to representation. How do agencies go about identifying barriers? What informations do agencies collect? What should they be collecting? And what information can representatives provide to help improve these systems?
I mean, let me jump in a little bit. I was going to perhaps address your last question along with all the dittos, because I really appreciated everyone's comments. And to me, it's actually quite helpful when you do hear the similar feedback from the various perspectives. And initially, I think from our perspective, looking at it, navigating the system, and I think, Didi, that's one of the things you were sort of saying, just sort of exhaustion, navigating the system, trying to like banging your head against the wall sometimes is part of that. But what we, at least my experience has been that for the subpart of the population that have the most difficulty navigating the system and helping to get access to it are the people who are dealing with, they're the vulnerable population who are the least sophisticated. English is obviously not their best language. There's cultural issues going on from our perspective too. Sort of sometimes the fear of engaging with the government, the distrust of government, and then on top of that, I know when, again, this is a little bit from my time on the bench, having to do with in the community, the misinformation about who is an attorney and who's not. Notario, for example, is not technically an attorney in the United States, but is one, based on my understanding, in the Latin American culture. So a lot of people came in and relied on notarios, and unfortunately, the notarios were preying on them, and they were charging and making promises, and frankly, they would get involved very early, then create a record that would come back and bite the people later on. And so I think that's sort of the issue of some of the barriers is the quality of representation, information about what kind of representation is necessary for them, and then feeling intimidated. A lot of times, I think even my sophisticated friends and colleagues who sometimes come and ask me about, well, I want an attorney, like who know they need an attorney. And you say, well, make sure you do your due diligence. I mean, it's very difficult to first find one. Second of all, question the attorney to make sure that the person is even competent in that area, and then to try to hold them accountable. I mean, that a lot of times the vulnerable population that we deal with have to do a lot of that kind of legwork too. But to your question about how do we sort of gauge some of that, I just had a couple of stats which we were looking at. Our top 10 application forms at USCIS generate the vast majority of our workload. I mean, we have the application for employment authorization last year generated, or fiscal year 2021 generated 2.5 or 2.6 million of our application requests. And in those, interestingly enough, it looks like we have over 52.5% representation. And I would put a little asterisk on that, in that when we talk about representation, we include accredited representatives. And I think we can talk about that too, which is the representation isn't just limited to licensed attorneys. Accredited representatives who have gone through some certification program and have been recognized by the Department of Justice as accredited representatives can help individuals navigate that. So I think that is one thing that we look at, is to look to see what are some of the benefit forms that are triggering it. But frankly, on our side, I can see, like on our U visa or even our special immigrant juvenile visa applications, which deal with the vulnerable population of victims of crime or unaccompanied minors. Unaccompanied minors, I don't think you can do that program without representation, because it requires a state court process and then coming to the federal court. So that's the other part, that sometimes the interplay, again, from our perspective of what's happening in other agencies or other processes and then coming back. So I don't know if I complicated the conversation or took it off your course, but I thought I would share some of those information points.
No, that's great. It's a complicated conversation, and an hour is not nearly enough time to have it in. So hopefully this is just the beginning of a conversation. You mentioned those magic words, accredited representatives. And I see we have a question on this point, and I think it ties in very well to possible solutions for addressing barriers. We're all lawyers here, and we tend to think these are legal processes. A lawyer has to be involved. But obviously, there's lots of programs where non-lawyers have played a major role. And one way to talk about perhaps expanding representational capacity is to talk about bringing non-lawyers into the picture. Karen Lash asks, maybe Nancy and Ashley in the first instance, can you speak to the use of accredited representatives in the proceedings that you've had experience with, non-lawyers in this space? How effective are they? Do we have any data on their effectiveness? And is there potential for scaling use of non-lawyers in these or other contexts? So maybe turn to you first, Nancy.
Yeah, I'm going to go back to a previous life, which was my life at Social Security. And there were a large number of lay representatives that provided representation, and the quality of their services varied. Social Security is a very specialized area, and if they applied themselves and became particularly knowledgeable in that area, they could be extremely effective. Some were a little more casual about it and were not so effective. So I think it's like anything else. You get out in the marketplace, and the quality of the services that you receive is going to depend largely upon the expertise that lay representative has developed. in the work that I do now, lay representatives are allowed. They can be family members, which would have essentially no training and no quote unquote accreditation. They could also be just lay representatives, but we don't have accreditation processes for that. These are just individuals who come in and would provide assistance. I think that does bring up some interesting questions. I know that some other federal programs have accreditation processes. So Ashley, I don't know about, I'm going to turn to you because you may have a different perspective.
Sure. And I was going to start again with a ditto in that my experience both on the bench and to a certain extent here, although I haven't been quite as engaged about the role of accredited representatives, is that they can absolutely fill a gap, a void, no doubt about it, because to the extent that a lot of times you just want to help someone make sure that the application that they're completing, that they understand it, it's properly translated for them, that they know what kind of evidence, things like that, to just help them navigate that system that way. Accredited representative can be a critical sort of bridging the gap resource. And right now, the Department of Justice, we use the Department of Justice accreditation program. There are over 800 accredited representatives, and there is a regulatory process, application process that they have to go through, and they would then become recognized as part of our sort of accredited representative list that we disseminate. We provide that information, and people can look to that as a resource. But having said that, again, Nancy, I did want to agree with you that my experience was the same. We had some amazing accredited representatives who were very well experienced, very well intentioned, very invested in the applicants that were the non-citizens that they were helping. And then we had others who were completely on the other side and who were just taking on large, frankly, they were in certain ways an extension of unscrupulous lawyers who were kind of using that as a mechanism to trigger perhaps ways to gain more drum up business, I suppose. So yes, it can be, to the question, a part of the solution, and it is in large part helping. But to your question, Jeremy, which I think is a really good question to always come back to, which is the data integrity. So what sort of data do we have to support it? We haven't dug in on that. And I welcome conversation about what are some of the ways that we can look at the data to see to what extent is it effective. Like we certainly keep track of the percentage of cases that are by representation, but it's very hard to tell. Well, of course, you can take a look at the outcome and maybe draw some conclusion, but that's not necessarily the case, because maybe they did help and the person is just not eligible, right? So, or maybe they really made the world of difference because they helped with it. Or sometimes they bring in that efficiency to the process. They get it right, from what Richard said, straight out of the gate at the early on. So I think it is a great part of the conversation, and there's more to be done on it, but we don't have enough. I don't have enough data to answer some of that question.
There's a word I've heard throughout this discussion, which is information. Perhaps one of the lowest cost things we can do is provide people with the information they need about the benefits of representation and about how to find qualified representatives. What roles should agencies and private sector organizations play in developing, disseminating this information? And are there any successes that you've seen, or where is there room for improvement? Richard, maybe I can turn to you first for information.
Sure. So it actually, I've been thinking about like the best solutions for expanding access. So this really goes to that. We partner with an organization here in Southeastern Pennsylvania called the Veterans Multi-Service Center. They're a program funded partially through VA's SSVF, Supplemental Supportive Services for Veteran Families. The program specifically for veterans and their families who are experiencing or at risk of experiencing homelessness. We train their case managers, their staff, their intake, everything about legal issues. So we talk with them about what is a custody matter, what is VA benefits, what is a discharge upgrade, what is Social Security, what's the eviction process in Pennsylvania, so that the people who get individuals first, I think people are more comfortable going to social service agencies because that makes sense. I'm having a housing issue, I'm going to go to an agency that can help me with housing. That may be the first step. So we do training with these individuals to ensure that they have an understanding when someone says, well, my heat's been turned off, it's the middle of February, is there something that can be done? And they're like, oh, I remember that we had a training about illegal utility shutoff, and this is what we should do, and we should contact the lawyer. And so then, kind of to the point that I think Nancy had made earlier, and I had talked about a little bit in regards to resources, because of our partnership with that organization, we can take that person on as a client, because through SSVF, that social service agency, VMC, pays us for our legal work. So we're not funding that individual through LSC. We're not funding that individual through one of our other funders. So we're able to assist that individual and look at their income, but it doesn't become as vital to determine our ability to assist. And so it kind of allows us to expand who we are able to help, focusing on veterans experiencing or at risk of experiencing homelessness. And so we're giving that information out to the community. And it's not just organizations like that, it's just talking in general. We do outreaches all the time to VA, to other offices in our community, and providing them the information of what do we do, and then knowing that the individuals who we are serving are going to them first, so they know that we are there. And as we work in the community, the veteran community is a very tight-knit community. And so as people understand that we are really here to help, people feel more comfortable giving that referral and saying, call this number, they can at least talk you through the process. So giving that information out becomes extremely valuable to people realizing and recognizing what we have the ability to do.
I'd like to jump in and just add to what Richard's saying from the legal aid provider's perspective. My program does a lot of talking about our work in administrative law, and we encourage other legal aid programs to do it. And we do that purposefully because we believe that, sort of the general public, and I know that's a pretty nebulous term, but the general public doesn't see administrative law as an important issue for equal justice for poor people. They see courts. When you talk about legal aid, people see an image of a courtroom, a county courtroom, the state Supreme Court, the US Supreme Court. They see courts. And so we think it's really important for legal aid to talk as much about administrative law and its importance to poor people and equal justice to poor people, as, in fact, I think we try to talk about it more than we talk about courts, to kind of counteract that idea that it's only about court access. And the other thought I have about just generally disseminating information about the availability of services and administrative processes is we encourage our colleagues in the legal aid field to look very creatively about and think outside the box. I'm sorry to use such a cliche, but to really think outside the legal aid box about who your potential partners are. One of our largest programs is our Reentry Legal Services project. And that project is funded by our state Department of Corrections using tax revenue. And what we're doing in that project is we're working with people who are incarcerated who are reentering, and they're folks who have, we believe, disabling conditions that prevent them from getting work when they leave incarceration. It's a little I guess I'll tout my program here a little bit. It's a little unusual in the legal aid field to think about your Department of Corrections as your partner in bringing more access to a really important administrative law process for a really significant part of our population. And I'm not saying you need to necessarily replicate that. I'm just encouraging my colleagues in legal aid to really think about not who your traditional partners are, but who has an interest in thinking about accessing administrative processes to move your system and our clients and their systems forward. The Department of Corrections funds us for this because they believe that our help in accessing Social Security and disability benefits for reentering folks helps them to not have to deal with those folks later on, that they're not going to redo, what's the word I'm trying to think of, reoffend and get back in the system. That's the reason that our department is interested in this administrative law process, is it helps keep folks out of their system later on.
So we've talked about expanding the role of non-lawyers and information dissemination. What other kinds of solutions should we be thinking about to reduce barriers that people face in accessing representation?
If you don't mind, if I'll jump in, I would go back to, and a couple of people have said this, the timing of when you jump in is really important. But we have found good success in starting at the initial application stage. And I know that's overwhelming for many in the legal aid movement to think about that, but we have tried to move as much of our services to the front end as we can. And we have found what I think is really good success there.
I may jump in on this one just to tout one of our, what I consider to be great successes, which is, I agree that on a macro level, in terms of guiding principles, everything we discussed should certainly be guiding us through this process. But sometimes when you look to how do you operationalize something, I think looking at it from the bite size portion is also helpful. So one of the things we look at is we have dozens and dozens of application forms, but not all of them are being equally used. So you want to take a look at the ones that are perhaps the largest of them. And so we do look at the top 10. And one of those top 10 application forms for us is our naturalization form. And there is a huge commitment. Our mission is to help welcome new Americans. And we have welcomed over 7.5 million new Americans, new naturalized citizens in the last decade, and close to 1 million last year. And I think one of the ways we've been successful at really helping people navigate our system at less than a 20% representation rate. So that's sort of what I want to connect the dots on, is it's been a combination of ways. One is partnership, and I think that's something both Didi and others and on the chat have also talked about. So we in fiscal year 2022, we awarded $20 million in grants to 66 organizations. And the grants were basically designed to help prepare people for the naturalization application process, because you need to have the English language skills, in the civics part, knowledge of the history. So just helping them go through that very substantive part is very important. We have a lot of free courses online that we help people, so they can just go online, go on our website and get sample tests, in different languages to help them be better, to better understand both the process as well as the eligibility requirements, as well as resources to be able to navigate that. And I think that has really paid off in dividends in those numbers. And this is where we do have the numbers looking at, as I said, close to 1 million people in the last fiscal year, less than 20% representation rate, have been able to successfully complete the process. And we've done it with partnership, we've done it with information, and we've done it in a collaborative way. But I will caveat it, it is sort of, by this time of the process, the person has now become familiar with USCIS, they're towards the end of the process. So I don't want to, I don't want to completely take it out of context, but I do think that sometimes just looking at it in bite-sized form would also help.
Thank you for talking about opportunities for partnership and collaboration. I think it's an important piece of this, and it's one I hope we'll talk about in future conversations. I see we have just over a minute left, and I think there's a critical piece of this discussion that we should have, which is what are the practical impediments to implementing these solutions? And I assume it comes down to one word: resources. Richard, maybe I can turn to you for the last minute to talk about resources.
I mean, there's not anywhere remotely close to enough money for anything. I think every single person on here would agree, whether it's a legal aid organization or a federal administrative agency. If we had more money to do what we need to do, then we would have everyone would be happy and life would be great. Or if we had more people, if we had the ability to, if there was more hours in the day, whatever the resource is that we don't have right now. And I think a lot of things that have been talked about have kind of get to that, especially what Ashley was talking about in regards to those partnerships, what Dee Dee was talking about with those partnerships, because we as attorneys can only do so much. But working with, like I was talking before, with social service agencies, they have the ability to do something. So combining our resources to really advocate for the individuals that we're working with. And I think that as more people become aware of the real impact that administrative agencies have on people's everyday lives and the benefits that can really come out of that, I think that hopefully, and this is just my big hope, more resources can come out of that.
Well, thank you all. That's all the time we have for today. Not nearly enough time to delve into all these important and critical issues. Thanks to all of our panelists for sharing their wisdom. Thanks to our audience for joining us today. We will publicize the remaining forums once those are detailed. Once those details are finalized, we'll publicize those on our respective websites. LSC will post the recording of the webinar on its Facebook and YouTube pages, and ACUS will make it available on its website as well. So with that, thank you all and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. Panel.
Thank you again for joining us today on this webinar. If you are interested in learning more about the series or about ACUS and LSC's work in this area, please reach out to either Stephanie Davis at LSC or Jeremy Grayboys at ACUS. Our contact information is in the chat. Thank you again to our wonderful panelists for sharing your knowledge and time with us today, and we hope to see you at a future LSC event. Happy holidays.